Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to show you how to make this really fun sketchbook wrap and pencil holder, and we're going to use fabric from the Annie's Creative Quilters Fabric Club. And the really fun thing about this club is that you get an assortment of fabrics delivered to your house every month, and you'll have perfectly coordinated fabrics, 6 different patterns, and they're all fat quarters, so they're really useful if you like to quilt or you like to do projects. If you don't know what you want to make, they all come with patterns. Like that one that I just showed you comes with a bag pattern, and the fabric that I'm going to use today actually came with a pattern for matching placemats and coasters. And I've got plenty of fabric left over from this, so I might make the coasters too because I do need some coasters. But I just love that it's all coordinated and picked out for me, and I don't have to go to the fabric store and be overwhelmed by all the choices. It's all there ready to go. You can get your first kit for $9.99. That's more than 50% off, and they'll actually send you some free gifts too. They're going to send you the basic stitching guide, an invisible marking pen, or a wash away marking pen I should say. It's not invisible or you wouldn't be able to use it, and also a set of 50 glass head pins so that when you sew you can actually press over them and not worry about melting them. So if you are ready to check that out, I've got a link in the video description so you can get 50% off, more than 50% off your first kit, and get your free gifts. So without further ado, let's go to the table and I'm going to show you how to make this. Oh, first I want to show you how cute it is when we open it up. So you open it up, and then we've got all of our art goodies in here, just enough to go out for a day of sketching, our sketchbook, our watercolor pencils. I even tucked in some little watercolor, sheets there, and pencil, sketchbook, water brush, the works. And you can make it customizable to whatever size sketchbook you want to hold. This one is a, I think it's about a 6x9 or 8x10 size sketchbook, but you can make it for whatever size book that you happen to have. So I'll put the measurements in the video description too in case you want to make it exactly like I do, but you can of course make it however you want. So without further ado, let's go to the table and get sewing. Okay, let's take a look at the project. I've started to prepare some pieces here. I started off by doing a sketch of what I want to accomplish, and that is a book wrap that will hold my sketchbook and also some watercolor pencils, water brush, maybe a small set of watercolors. And I basically wanted it to be kind of like a book jacket. And so I started off by doing a sketch, and then I took my trusty rotary cutter. You can use scissors if you want, but I really like a rotary cutter because it's easy to do long, straight cuts. I'm going to set these aside because these are the scraps of the fabric, so I have a little bit of every pattern left over, which is really great. Actually, I have quite a bit left over because these samples are pretty generous, and I want to show you what the basic pieces that we're going to be working with are. So for the inside of the book, we're going to have, or the wrap, we're going to have this beautiful batik. The nice thing about these batiks is that they're pretty on both sides. We will, but if you were using like a printed fabric, just make sure your pretty side is down. And then I'm simply just using a piece of felt for my batting, and I wanted this to be just about the same size as the size I want my wrap to be when I'm done. So if I fold that in half, I want it to be just about the same size as my book, maybe just a little tiny bit bigger to account for like the pencils and other things I'm going to have in there. And then we're going to do a method that's called quilt as you go, and I like this because you don't end up with a quilted top and then have to quilt it to some backing later. You have it all done in one go. So what I've done here is I have cut these other strips to 3.5 inches by 10 inches. This piece here is 10 by 14 roughly. You can adjust it to be whatever size book you want to make. So then what I'm going to be doing is I will be sewing this, like I'll sew this first strip here, and then I will fold it over like this, and then I'll sew my next strip on like this. I just think it's easier if I explain it like this. I'll sew this next strip on just like that. So I'm going through all my layers, and then I'll fold this down like this, and so on and so forth. And I will just walk you through this whole thing because I think it will make a little more sense, because when my mother first explained this technique to me, I didn't know what she was talking about until I actually tried it for myself. So I'll sew that down, and then I'll fold it over like that. I'm going to sew this one down here. So just keep in mind, if you're using a fabric that is one-sided, make sure when you sew it down, you've got the pretty side down and the back side facing up at you. Then you're going to fold this down. You're going to fold this over your stitching, and then if everything works out right and your seams are good and tiny, then you'll just put your last piece down like that, and then you'll sew that down, and then you fold it over. So this is then what you're going to have. So we have all this extra space, and the reason I like to have this extra space is because I like to use this as my binding. So I can fold this over, press it, and fold it over one more time, and then I can finish all my edges like that. So you can see this would be a really easy way to do a placemat as well. So let's sew it to this point, and then we are going to come back and work on our pocket and do our other pieces. But I want to do step by step. So this is our first step. I'll meet you over at the sewing machine and I'll show you how I put it together. I'm going to choose a straight stitch here, so I'm moving this over to straight, and I've got about a 6, the smallest stitch that this machine does, which is just a little bit bigger than a basting stitch. It doesn't do a really tiny one. And then I'm going to grab my first piece of fabric, like I mentioned before, and this is probably the only place you have to just make sure you don't get confused, is that you are going to stitch it right along your batting. So see, if I peel that back, that's how it's going to look. And you're just going to do a straight stitch. Now once you get if you want to pin this first piece down, go right ahead. I'm not, because felt is quite sticky. It holds stuff really well, so I think I'm going to be all right. I'm just gonna, I like to do a couple stitches and then just do a back stitch. Now it's not really super necessary when you're doing, your stitches are going to be stitched over in the opposite direction, but I think because I have more experience sewing clothing, it just makes me feel more comfortable to do that. So now I'm just going to carefully stitch down this line. And at the bottom, I am going to do a back stitch. And then we'll take a look at this. Trim your string closely. It'll just, you know, make less work for you later. Now you will be able to see a little bit of that batting there. Don't worry though, because it's going to be covered up when you do your binding step. So you don't let that bother you. Now if you decided that you didn't want to try to work that in as your binding, it's really simple, but if you don't want to do that for whatever reason, you can trim it when you're all done and use a little seam binding and trim it that way, or some bias tape. Whatever you want to do is fine. And now I am going to put my next strip of fabric down. Just make sure you can press this too at this point if you want to. I'm lazy, so I'm not going to. That's really what it boils down to too. So basically now this time it gets easier, because now all I have to do is line up these two pieces. Now I'm stacking this directly on top. See how easy that is? That first stitch you made, that's the hardest part of this whole project. Okay, so you get through there, you are golden. And we are just going to do, I'm doing about a 1/4 inch seam allowance here between the edge of the fabric and where my needle's coming down. Again, I'm doing my back stitch even though you probably don't need to, and I'm going to sew straight down. I chose gold thread because, or yellow thread, because I thought it matched a lot of the colors and undertones that was in this fabric. The only thing you want to keep aware of as you're going, just make sure your fabric is smooth on the back. Okay, so you want to make sure you don't get any bunches or puckers as you're going. You don't want to sew a wrinkle into your project. That would be a big bummer. So just make sure you can smooth it down. And again, we're going to take this next color. This is the way it's going to go for the rest of the way. We're going to stack that on, and again, sew right down that line. So keep on in that fashion until you've used up all of your fabric. And if you run out too early, just cut another strip of fabric and finish up that way. When you get to the end, your last strip is sewn on, you're going to have probably a little leftover. What you want to do, and if you don't have any leftover, you can just top stitch it down. If it like lines up just right, or you have a little gap, just top stitch it down. Don't worry about seeing any of that felt if you do, because as long as it's not more than like a 1/4 inch, it's going to be covered by your binding. But since I have excess, and this is going to be a pencil wrap, or I'm going to be sewing elastic down, any extra stability from extra layers of fabric is actually going to help me out. So what I'm going to do is just tuck under the excess, and I am going to stitch it down. I just want to make sure that I don't have any gaps, so it helps if you have a flat table where you can smooth it out. I'm going to do that and then stitch it. Okay, I just finger pressed it, just kind of flattened it down on the little table next to me. And now I'm just going to top stitch. And a top stitch is when you're stitching on top and you're not going to see a raw edge. Don't be worried if it's not perfect though, because like I said, we're going to be wrapping that binding around. You're not really going to see that stitching though, but that's just to kind of show you what it's supposed to look like. And yeah, after you do that, what I want you to do to prepare for the pocket is to take those other strips that we had left over, and we're just going to sew them together so we make one big piece of fabric that's really colorful and pretty. And I've already done 3 pieces there. I'm just kind of putting right sides together and stitching them with about 1/4 inch seam until I've used up all those strips. And the reason why I have these shorter strips is because I took my fat quarters and rotary cut those 3.5 inch wide strips for our quilting strips here. And then, so I had extra strips there, so after I trimmed them down to 10 inches because I used the whole fat quarter side, and that's what I'm stitching together. So it just saved me some work, and it's going to look really fun and colorful. I wanted to come back over to the table because I want to trim the border a little bit, because I'm going to go upstairs and press my fabric, and I'm also going to take this strip that we've sewn together and I'm going to press open all of these seams. So to do that, you simply open the seams like this with your fingers, and then you're going to iron down on that so that these will fold flat, and that will just make everything look nicer when you sew it together. Also, when I go upstairs, I'm going to be pressing the edges so that I'll make the nice binding strips, but in order to do that, I first want to make sure that I have these trimmed evenly. So I want them trimmed to about, I would say about 1 inch. In order to do that, I'm going to use my handy dandy quilting ruler here, and I am simply going to line it up so that the little markings, I think I have it upside down, there we go. I don't use this too much, as you can see. So my little markings align with the felt, basically. And I'm going to use my rotary cutter. Let me just move that up a little bit. You can see the reflections on my light. Sorry about that glare, guys. And I am going to trim that with my rotary cutter. So whenever you're not using your cutter, put the guide up so you don't cut yourself. That is so razor sharp. If you have little kids around, just make sure you keep this somewhere where they can't get a hold of them. And then I'm actually going to turn my whole mat around, which I know probably isn't how like a good quilter would do it, but it just makes sense for me. I am going to trim down that far, and then I'm just going to shuffle my ruler down and get the rest of it. We make it work, right? We make it work. And the reason, I've got a little overhang up there, so I want to make sure that it's more aligned with the felt than it is with the fabric if I have the fabric overhanging a little bit. I just want to keep my lines fairly straight. There we go. And again, looking at my felt line, I want about 1 inch. I'm going to turn my ruler here. So I have that inch on the edge. Take your time in measuring. And I always like to cut, for whatever reason, I like to cut with my fabric. I like to be cutting with my fabric to the left of me so I can hold it down, and so that I am cutting with my right. And this side is actually pretty good. Maybe just trim a teeny bit off of the end there just so it's nice and even, but this side was pretty close. Now the reason I wait till the end to trim it and I don't just cut it down when I begin is because things can wiggle around when you're sewing, and by waiting to trim I know I'm going to have the neatest edge. Now it looks like this edge is narrower, but it's not. It's just that the fabric was just a little bit longer. I gave myself about 1/4 inch wiggle room with my fabric there. So again, to reiterate, I am going to press up like that and all the way around, and then we'll come back and sew that, and we're also going to sew our pocket. Okay, so I've pressed my seams flat here, and if you had trouble with that, you could just press them to one side. For this technique, they don't really need to be flat, but it's a good technique to get in the habit of. And then I pressed my placemat and I folded over the edges, but I wanted to show you I did cut little notches out, pretty much cut squares out of the corners so that I wouldn't have a lot of bulk when I went to stitch this down. So now I'm just going to stitch down around all of these, and I want to be really tidy with my stitches. I want them to look really nice because they're going to show, okay? So very carefully, you want to get, I would say, about 1/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch from the edge. You want to make sure that you're going through all of your layers, and you want to back stitch on this one because they're going to be the stitches that lock everything down. So go ahead about 5 stitches, and you want to back all the way to the edge. And then you're just going to go around the whole perimeter about, I would try to be around 3/8 of an inch from that folded over seam. That will just ensure that you've folded over everything and everything is securely trapped in your stitches. Now you can stop right here and have a really snazzy placemat, but we are going to keep on trucking with our original plan. So the next thing we're going to do is our pocket. So I'm going to set this aside. This is going to be the outside cover of our sketchbook, and then this is going to be the interior, so that way we'll have some of that multicolored fabric going on the outside and the inside, because our pocket's going to have the multicolors as well. So what we're going to do here is sew these together, right sides together. We're going to sew them up into a long tube like this, okay? So we're just going to do one straight stitch for right now, okay, right along the raw edge. We can actually go ahead and sew up this bottom edge too, so we're leaving one end of the tube open. Just peeking under there to make sure that my fabric's meeting up. Turn it. And back stitch here at the end. Now we're going to turn this right side out. Trim your threads too while you're at it. I like to use a knitting needle to get those points out there. So you get a nice square edge. If you had a lot of fabric, or your fabric was thick, you could have chopped those, just cut those corners before you turned them right side out. And now that's going to be the pocket. I'm going to press it and then come back and we're going to sew that into our sketchbook wrap. Okay, so here is the tube. I've pressed it. You can see the seam on the back side. And I'm going to line that up on the bottom of the solid side of my pouch like that. And over here, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to turn this inside out so that it'll kind of hem itself when I sew the pocket down. So I'm just going to turn this inside. It's kind of like if you're making a rice bag, how we, after you'd fill it with rice, you would turn this in and then you would sew it. That's what I'm going to do. Just turn it in and just make sure it's the same length as my sketchbook wrap. It's all lined up and I want to sew it as close as possible to the edge and as neatly as possible because if I take too big of a seam allowance, I'm not going to be able to fit my sketchbook in into 1/2 of my my thing here. I'm actually going to start it over on this side so I can work my way around. And we're top stitching, so be as neat as you can. These stitches are going to be visible. Get on the edge as closely as you can. If your material ever starts to pucker on you, like mine is here, what you want to do is try to get the needle into the fabric, but before the pucker, lift up your presser foot and just try to ease it a little bit. Try to smooth it out with your fingers and try to take up that tension maybe by pulling it forward or pushing it back somehow so that you're not going to be sewing down that pucker and getting a wrinkle in your fabric. And then once you've got that eased, you can continue sewing. And make sure you backstitch when you get to the end of this pocket. Oops. There we go. So what you should have is a nice pocket here that looks pretty nice because you took care with your stitching, and now we can divide up our pockets. Okay, so I put my sketchbook in the pocket here. All right, I do like the way it's oriented there, and I have to make sure that I have enough room for my book to fold over, but I also have to have room for that sketchbook, and that sketchbook is taking up half of the space. But I need my seam for this pocket to be slightly over to the left because I need that gusset for the sketchbook to fit. So what I'm going to do here is, hopefully you can see, I am going to figure out exactly where that pocket needs to be, and I am going to measure with, mark it with my chalk here. Okay, because I want to make sure that that is going to, that my sketchbook's going to be able to fit in there, and it's got to be pretty precise because I didn't leave that much room for error. So what I'm going to do is sew down on that line. The line's a little crooked, so I'm just going to make sure that I keep it pretty straight on my sewing machine. Here, better to make the pocket just a smidgen too big than too small, but still, I want it to be pretty accurate. Now, if I was to fold this right in half, I don't think, let's just try that. If I was to fold this right in half, I wouldn't be on that line, I don't think. I'd be pretty close. I'd be about 1/4 of an inch over from the halfway point, if you're at all curious. And you're just going to straight stitch, make sure you back stitch at the front, top and bottom of this row. And let's just check to make sure our sketchbook still fits in there. Oh, it does. Yay. Okay, wonderful. It still fits. Perfect. Okay, so you can either leave this side open or you can stitch it up to make one more pocket. I'm inclined to leave it open because I don't know what I'm going to want to put in there. So the next step is going to be doing some elastic, and I've got my elastic trim here. And you can get elastic in different widths. You shouldn't need anything too heavy duty, but the wider your elastic, the stronger it is. Since this is just going to hold pencils, I don't think it needs to be that strong, but I'm going to see my options and then make a decision as to what I need. I decided I'm going to do elastic all the way across this in case I decide in the future that I don't want to use it with my sketchbook anymore. I'll have a pencil wrap, so it just gives me a little more versatility with this particular project because, you know, we've spent some time on this, so we want to make it as versatile as possible. So I made a chalk line so I don't get mixed up. And I am going to start by sewing down the end, and I'm just going to fold it over so it doesn't fray. Let me pull this a little bit closer. I'll zoom in for you. And for this first stitch, I'm actually going to use a zigzag stitch. And that will also give me a guide on the back as to where my button's going to go. Now I'm going to switch to a straight stitch, and I am just going to sew every, probably every inch or so, because I can always put a couple pens in place if I want to. I don't have to do a slot for every pen. I can do a couple pens together. And I'm not even going to trim my thread until I'm all done. That's a little time saving measure there. So just work your way down. Make sure to back stitch to keep it strong. And just shuffle it down an inch and keep on going and stay on your line that you made with chalk. And when you get to the end, we're going to leave a little bit more elastic, and I'll show you that when we get there. When you get to the end, you want to cut about 4 or 5 inches of elastic, and you're going to tuck that under. This is going to make a loop that is going to be where we attach the button. That's a little long, actually. Let's make that a little bit shorter. So I get about 3 inches hanging off the end there. going to fold that in half, so when you stitch down this last bit here right on the seam, right on the edge, it's going to trap down both of the tails of that elastic. So then we'll have our nice closure that will go around a button that we're going to sew over here. So it's going to all close right up. It's going to be really, really slick. And then after you have done this, you can go through and you can snip all of these little joining threads because you don't need them. They were just, you know, just saved us a little time. We didn't have to, and saved us quite a bit of thread too if we had to start and stop every time. So you can just go and snip those away on both sides. Okay, and here's how it looks with everything all trimmed. Not too bad. It doesn't even look, oh, now I've got all those little bits of, yeah, you're going to need to vacuum after this project. You're going to have so many little bits of string here and there, but it doesn't look bad. I'm glad I went with a yellow thread because I think it's nice and cheerful. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is put a button on so that our little tab can reach around and latch our little book cover here. And I found this cute purple one with an anchor on it. So like I mentioned, that right where our string starts, right where our elastic starts, that's where we want to go in with our needle. And we're going to actually just very simply add a button. Now this is a shank button. I'm using embroidery floss, so it's really strong. I'm only going to go through it once, and that should do it. So in through my little buttonhole, going back down next to in through the fabric next to where I came in, and then I'm just going to tie the ends together on the back, and that's all there is to that. And that's going to be super secure because embroidery floss is nice and thick. So I'm going to tie that up, and then we're going to fill this and see how it looks. So let's look at how I filled up this bad boy. I'm so pleased with the way it turned out. You can see the back, we've got our button closure, so many fabulous colors and patterns. I just love it. So to open it up, of course, we just pull the elastic loop off of the button, and we have room for a set of 12 watercolor pencils, a regular pencil, a water brush. I tucked my watercolor sheets in here. These are my Viviva watercolor sheets. Those are handy because all I need is a water brush, and there's tons of color in there. And of course my sketchbook, and if we change our mind and decide we don't want to use a sketchbook in the future, we can always put more pencils in there, and we could even just roll it up. We would need like a larger elastic or something to close it, or we just need to hold it like that, but it gives you another bit of versatility with this project. I really had a lot of fun using these fabrics. If you would like to find out about the fabrics I used and the Annie's Creative Quilters Fabric Club, check out the link in the video description. You'll get your first kit for $9.99, so that's a great way to check it out and see if you like it before committing. So I've always been pleased with the things that I've got from Annie's, and I think you will too. And for me as a beginner, the thing I like the most is that I don't have to go into the fabric store and get overwhelmed and try to choose the best fabrics. They're going to pick ones that are already coordinated and look great together, and that's going to save me time and money, and I really appreciate that. So if you are, especially if you're a beginner like me, but even if you're a more seasoned quilter, go check them out. Every selection comes with a pattern, so if you don't know what you want to do with the fabrics, there are some ideas for you to use them, and they have just beautiful instructions as always. So I want to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new here. And until next time, happy crafting! Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to show you what fell. Oh, my bracelet came off.